Jim Comey has been a central figure in some of the most enduring events in our recent history, as many of you know. As Deputy Attorney General, he was in the hospital room of then AG John Ashcroft in 2004, as Bush administration officials pressed for reauthorization of the domestic surveillance program. As FBI Director, many of you all know, maybe, he reopened the federal review of Hillary Clinton's use of her private email server in the final days of the 2016 presidential campaign. And shortly after acknowledging the FBI was investigating the Trump campaign's contacts with Russia, FBI Director Comey was fired by then President Trump in a thunderclap that reverberates to this day. My Comey moment may not make everyone's top 10, but I think it's worth telling nonetheless. It was just days after he reopened, or the FBI reopened, the Clinton investigation, that the director ventured over to a very public memorial service for a beloved DOJ official, David Margolis, long regarded as the conscience of the department. Comey walked into the Justice Department's cavernous Great Hall. If you all have not been there, you will be treated just to see it. It's a beautiful place. With wary colleagues who had publicly denounced his actions just days earlier. It was filled with those kinds of folks. But as I recall, instead of confronting them, the director immediately diffused what was an incredibly tense moment by any standard, by imagining what his friend David Margolis might say of his predicament. As I recall, he said, "I can picture him standing right there and looking at me and smiling and saying, you know, we're going to be able to have your memorial service in a lot smaller room." Please welcome Jim Comey, who may be the first FBI director to become a best-selling author.
I just went back to that moment.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about that. Wow. I felt like, spoiler alert, Bruce Willis in the movie where he doesn't know he's dead, walking into that room. What was that movie? Sixth Sense, because it was 2 or 3 days after the Clinton investigation came back to life. Yikes. So anyway, I don't want you. I mean, if you want to ask me about that, that's fine, but I'm not going to open with that. So thanks for giving me a chance to visit with you. As I thought about what to do, I'd rather take your questions, but I'm just going to start with a few thoughts about justice and the media in particular that I hope will stimulate our conversation. You can ask me then anything you want about anything you want, and I promise you a direct answer. I was pretty open when I was FBI, and now I'm just a guy in a sweater, so I'll say almost anything. And so let me share my thoughts about justice, and especially justice and the media. When you lead an organization like the Department of Justice, you come to realize that its lifeblood is the faith and confidence of the American people. That the American people, by and large, trust that justice is just. That statue that we so often display at courthouses, where a female figure is holding scales, she's blindfolded in the way that Americans depict that statue. And that's to capture something, which is that we're going to try and render justice without regard to what people look like, who they love, where they come from, what money they have. And if you know the story of America, you know that our efforts to achieve that have been decidedly imperfect. But it remains the goal of our justice system. And so if you lead a justice organization like the Department of Justice or the FBI, despite what your parents may have taught you, my parents were big people telling me, you can't care what other people think, which was useful to me. But you really have to when you lead a justice organization, because what people think of you is that lifeblood, is that faith and confidence. It's really important that when FBI agents knock on a door and ask a question or make a promise or stand up in a courtroom and swear to tell the truth and then offer testimony about what they found in some politician's sock drawer, that they are believed. there's a moral imperative there. There's also an effectiveness imperative. If you're going to be able to achieve your goals as a justice organization, you have to be trusted. And so maintaining that faith and confidence, that trust, of all the best leaders I've worked for, and you mentioned maybe the best I've known, David Margolis, that what people think and how they perceive what you're doing becomes an obsession, and it should be. Now, it's an obsession where you're standing on difficult ground to begin with. When you're the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General or the FBI Director, you're a political appointee leading an organization that, if it's to be trusted, has to be perceived as outside of politics. And so that's a weird place to be. And I've always believed, and still do, that it would be a mistake if America moved to a non-politically appointed justice leadership. I think that would remove a tether of accountability that's really important in a justice system. And so I've always liked it and feared it, that the leaders of the Department of Justice are politically appointed. And the way I've tried to explain it to them is with a kind of homely, but for me, a fun metaphor. I go once a year to the beach in North Carolina, to the Outer Banks, the series of barrier islands. And where I go, there's two barrier islands that come close together. And so you have a place where the ocean water literally comes into contact with the placid waters of the Sound or the Bay. And it's a weird spot because I've stood there on the corner at the end of one of the barrier islands and watched, and you can see turbulence because these two different bodies of water have very different characteristics. And when they meet, it's a frothy area. And so what I've always told justice leaders is when you are a political appointee at the Department of Justice, that's where you stand. That you stand right on the spot where the political waters of the ocean, choppy, frothy, difficult, treacherous, meet the apolitical waters of the Bay or the Sound, which is your workforce and your mission. Those two things have to be separate, except they meet where you stand. And I tell everyone, look, I don't know exactly how do you strike the right balance, but knowing that you're standing in a treacherous spot is the beginning of finding your balance. And so how did I approach it? I thought the absolute best thing to do was to share as much as we could about our work as widely as we could, so that people could see us, the work, and the people up close and know us. And if they knew us, they would believe us or find us to suck in certain ways and force us to get better. And so my moderator knows this, but it's the reason I did this weird thing at the FBI where I had quarterly meetings with all the press that covered the FBI and had them sit around a table in a part right out near the director's office that I gather was built for Hoover to be able to entertain in a grand fashion. But he died before he could ever occupy that awful building. And so there's this big space, like a dining room that's not used. I never ate there, but I would host foreigners and the media. And we would all sit around this big table, and I would sit at one end. And I didn't do any video recording because I thought, I don't want people to perform. I really want them to ask me hard questions, and I'll give them honest answers. And I did that because I thought I had to, that was my obligation. And what's funny is a lot of times people would mistake my efforts at this kind of transparency for ambition. Like he wants to be famous or he's running for office. And my parents were mostly right. I can't care too much what people think. People who would say that didn't understand what my obligations were as a leader of the Justice Department. And so I would sometimes be there bragging about stuff we did, sometimes talking about terrible things that had happened. The most painful day for me was when I called you all together to tell you that we had let Dylan Roof buy the gun that he murdered all those good folks at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, and we had made a mistake. But I thought, that's what I got to do, because if I'm going to maintain the faith and confidence of people, I got to show them the work. It's the reason I was so frustrated watching the silence that followed the court-authorized search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. 3 days of silence, except not silence, because a lot of lies were told about the FBI and the Justice Department, yet those organizations were silent. And I'm not in touch with those leaders, so I don't know what their thinking was, but I remember thinking from the sideline, you got to get out there. You've got to explain to people why you're doing what you're doing, because in the absence of your voice, that spot is being filled. It's the reason I was so keen to push police departments around the country in the wake of a shooting of controversial use of force by uniformed law enforcement. It's really important to get as much transparency out there as fast as we can to show people the work. And you can condition it and tell people the investigation has to continue. There's a lot we don't know, but here's what we know so far. And I remember police chiefs telling me that goes against everything we are taught, learned through our culture, that no, we don't talk during an investigation. But if people are going to understand your work and trust that the justice system is just, your best chance of achieving that is to share information. So, all of this brings the media in. The only way I can share my work with the American people, if I'm the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General or the FBI Director, in the main is through you. And so I believe it was really important to have a professional press operation, one that didn't view the press as an enemy, because the press makes it sound like it's a monolith, like you all are some identical people with identical interests. You're as much complicated and interesting and frustrating as we are. But to cultivate relationships so information flows freely, so that people can see the work as much as possible. And I often hear it say, well, we should let the work speak for itself. And I'm not sure I know exactly what that means, because the work can't really speak for itself unless you find ways to show it to people who can then show it to the American people. That is, if you make a court filing, you don't tell anyone you did it. The only people who will find the filing will be those who are on pace or checking on a regular basis. And so your ability to share information widely will be impeded there. And it's why I think it's so important that law enforcement in this country come to understand how Americans get their information. Right? It's not good enough just to stand up at a podium as a law enforcement leader and make a statement 2 days after something happened or a day after something happened, because right, if you're going to have a press conference to announce that Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce are dating, everybody already knows that, and they've watched all the videos, and it's buzzed in their pockets. People aren't getting their information the way they used to. So finding a way as a leader of a justice organization to ask, how do people get their information, and how can I use those modes so that I meet my obligation of fostering confidence in this organization by showing the work as often as possible to the people who I'm supposed to be serving and protecting. And so to my mind, I guess this is a relatively high level what I was just laying out for you, but I think that's where a leader has to start. That I don't want to be famous. I was never, ever, ever, and still never, ever, ever going to run for office. I didn't love a lot of public engagement. There were plenty of days when I was like, shit, I got to go sit and talk to these guys again. And I used to say, look, I love you all as people, but as a concept, you drive me insane. And yet I did it even when I didn't feel like doing it, because I think it's my job. And I used to argue with Bob Mueller, my predecessor, about this, because he saw it differently than I did. And I would accuse him of being a dinosaur and being old school. And of course I think I'm right, and I still in hindsight think I'm right, that we are best served by people understanding the work, and they can only understand the work if we offer maximum transparency. And there's lots of room under the law and under our rules and policies, under our norms at justice organizations to offer that transparency. And so that's why it was so important to me, and that's why I believe your role is so important. Your jobs are unbelievably hard, and you all know this, but in a world where you have to generate clicks, where you are under tremendous pressure not to invest the time, to run something down, to try and cultivate another source and develop that source, your jobs are really, really hard. I can't do anything about that, except I hope I have a press office that understands the burdens you operate under and is able to work with you on that to achieve my goal while allowing you to achieve your goals. And so where are we as a justice system? Probably a number of different places at the same time. I'll talk about one that I spent a lot of time on at the FBI. The relationship between police departments and communities they serve, especially communities of color, and I don't really love that term because I think it obscures a real challenge. I think the problem in law enforcement is in the overwhelming main between law enforcement organizations and communities in cities that are mostly black, some Latino, significant Latino communities, but those relationships remain very seriously challenged and strained. And all of you know us here in America, we only pay attention to something in 5-year cycles. So we've forgotten that challenge again. And I hope it won't take another series of tragedies before we talk about it again. The energy of 2020, which replicated the energy of 2015, has largely been lost. And so I can't tell you exactly where we are in that respect. The justice system at the federal level, I think, is going to be fine. If you want to ask questions about how I saw it during the last administration, I'm happy to answer those. But I believe there are quality people leading the United States Department of Justice now, people of character and integrity. I would do things differently in terms of interacting with the public. I think I just made that clear. But these are quality people who care about getting it right. But it's under attack in a frontal assault like I've not seen in my lifetime. And which is why my response to that is we need to show the work and show the people as much as possible. Show the people who are doing the work to the American public as often as possible. And then I'll say maybe one other thing. I did a strange thing at the FBI. I worked very hard to try and get people like Dick Wolf to produce TV shows about the FBI, because I saw that as another way of showing the work to the American people. It turns out that paid off. I remember meeting with him and saying, why do I turn on the TV and see NCIS all the time? They're a fine organization, but there's like 8 people who work at it, NCIS. And now I turn on the TV and I got FBI all over the place. That's a good thing in the main. It's incomplete. Your work is much more reality-based, but it helps to show an organization to the American people that matters. So I am optimistic about America. I am optimistic about the justice system in America, which I think the journey of America and the Department of Justice and the justice system more broadly in America is one of continuous progress. And I've often described it to university audiences like this. If you graphed progress in America, both as a nation and in our justice system, so on the x-axis you would have time, progress on the y-axis, our line slopes upward constantly. We never get to where we need to be. We were born in original sin in this country, and we are always falling short of our ideals, but we're making progress consistently. But if you stare at the line, it's a jagged line. We make progress, we retreat. We make progress, we retreat. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic about America is I have a really reasonably good understanding of our history and have seen us make tremendous progress long before we were all born, and then retreat, and then make the progress again and retreat. The cool thing about America is that the subsequent progress always exceeds the retreat that came before, which is why the line has an upward slope. So I am optimistic about America. That's one reason. 2 reasons. I worried, when I got fired, I spent the first year at Howard University teaching, which was really cool for me. I don't know if it was cool for them, but I learned a tremendous amount. And I thought, I got to keep teaching and speaking because I'm worried that young people will withdraw from public service professions, and you're in one. And if they withdraw, then we're totally screwed. And so what I ought to do is I ought to try and encourage them to participate in the life of their country, whether that's in a nonprofit space or going into government or journalism, be involved in making us better. And the good news is I needn't have worried, because I've actually seen the opposite happen. A whole lot of young people, including my own children, saying, yeah, thanks, Boomer, you screwed it up. We are going to make a difference. And so the outpouring of public spiritedness has been really cool to watch. And so when I see those 2 things together, America's always been screwed up. We always make progress, retreat, make progress, retreat. We will be okay in the long run, is how I think about us. And I'm excited to see how people like you and people like my kids make us better. So that's probably too long, but hope then you now ask me about anything you want. But those are my initial thoughts.
Hi there, I'm Brian Mesker with Insider. Wanted to ask you kind of a broad question, which is, you've been the subject of controversies both on the left and on the right. How do you think history will remember you, and how often do you think about that question?
The second part is easy, not much. Because I don't associate my identity with my work. Right? If you shook me awake and asked me who I am, my answer, I'd be garbled, but my answer wouldn't relate to any of the jobs I've held, because the center of my life is much more personal. It's about being a dad and a grandfather and a spouse and a neighbor, that kind of stuff. And so I don't, but I also don't love being criticized. And it's fading, thank goodness, but there's passion on both ends of our bell curve. And so, how do I think about that? I've come to believe there's not much I can do about it. That I just can't explain myself. One of the great frustrations about October 28th was, 2016, is I had no chance to explain what I was doing and why. And we all, when we debated it as a team and agreed, you know what, if we try and have a press conference now, because people forget about it, I actually didn't make a press statement. I sent a letter to the ranking and chairs of the committees that I and Loretta Lynch had testified in front of to correct the record. But if I held a press conference, it would just be, what would I say? But never having that chance to explain was frustrating to me. But I've come to realize I've thought about the decisions I've made 1,000 times is probably not enough. And I'm very proud of the way the decisions were made. And I'm comfortable with the decisions, even though I see thoughtful people who see it differently, and that's okay. So I'm at peace with those decisions. It was never my goal to be famous. I want to lie on my deathbed and know that I was a great husband and father and grandfather, maybe great-grandfather, if I can live long enough. And so that combination of things makes me kind of okay. After my first book came out, some Irish radio interviewer asked me, "Why aren't you in therapy?" And I said, first of all, I'm married to a therapist, so I'm getting it all the time. But that's the reason, that I think that it's really important to try to design your world, if you're in the decision-making role, so that you'll have a good chance of making thoughtful decisions, and then make them, and then close the window as far as you can. Don't close it all the way, but the metaphor I use is, I have to close the window so it's just on a crack. Because especially in the 16, 17, if I open the window all the way, I'm just overwhelmed, and there's no way I can find a signal in that noise. But I can't close the window all the way, or I may miss thoughtful criticism. Somebody may see something that I didn't see that would make me smarter or better. And so I try and find ways to leave a metaphorical crack to let people speak who I know are thoughtful, or see some of the logic of somebody who may have a different take than I do, and consume it that way. And then shut off comments on the former Twitter, shut off comments on Instagram, because that's part of closing the window. So it isn't overwhelming. And that combination of things leaves me in a pretty good place. I've always thought that doubt is strength and not a weakness. And so I'm constantly asking myself, have I fallen in love with my view of something? Have I convinced myself of something? Am I missing something? But doing that based on stimulation that's coming through the crack. I hope that makes sense. I never thought I would be FBI director. That's the other thing. It's so strange. Yep.
Hi, so my name is Christina. I work for CBS News. And so I know you said that you're hopeful about the future, and you also mentioned that you consider that right now the DOJ and the FBI are doing a decent job. But my question is, obviously, we are seeing now GOP candidates having this approach to these two institutions, saying that if they would be elected, they would dismantle basically both institutions and basically bring them up. While you mentioned that you're positive and hopeful for the future, does this approach from these candidates concern you at all? Obviously, taking consideration, let's not think maybe like much longer ahead, but let's just say in the next 4 years, like this approach of like dismantling the DOJ or dismantling the FBI, like is this something that concerns you, taking consideration everything that's happening right now?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and I think it has to be a worry. If I were currently in, my 10-year term is now expired, so even if I hadn't been fired, I'd be out. But if I were still there, I'd be worrying about it very much because it affects you at those doorways, in those courtrooms, in the day-to-day cases that people don't follow, that they never heard of. If you're encountering people, again, the beauty of America is there's always a significant wingnutty lump of America. And the question is, how large does the wingnut collection get in America? And it ebbs and flows. And so if it gets larger based on people consuming lies about the FBI or the Department of Justice, that's a problem because then those people, if they're on a jury, if they're in a doorway, if they're reporting a crime, won't trust the people they're interacting with and won't trust the results of their work. So in the short term, sure, you have to worry about it. And, you know, sometimes you have to laugh because the idea that the FBI is a left-wing cabal is so crazy. As go into an FBI gym, the fitness center, an FBI gym, you will not find I don't mean to see if MSNBC's here, but you will not find MSNBC on FBI television. Like any law enforcement, military, martial organization, for reasons that completely make sense, it skews right of center. And so everybody in the FBI is like, these people are just insane. They're just making stuff up. Sure. And so in the long run, we'll be fine because the wingnuttery will shrink. But yeah, you have to worry about a threat to your effectiveness. It's why I was so much pain watching the lies about the search at Mar-a-Lago. Because millions of Americans who are good people internalized falsehoods about the FBI and its conduct that bell was not unrung by a press conference by the Attorney General, who's an amazing person, 3 days later. Because they've already consumed that on their feeds and talked to their friends and family for 3 days. And so that's something you have to worry about as a leader at the Department of Justice. Because that kind of doubt hurts the country in larger ways, obviously, and if it hurts your effectiveness. And again, so I'm telling you two things I hope aren't in logical tension. One is we're going to be okay in the long run. The FBI's brand and identity is so strong, and its reality is, we live in a reality world, and so its reality is not in the place where things people are saying about it. But we should still worry as a leader about what's the effect on the organization in the short term. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Matthew Choi with the Texas Tribune. I was wondering, you mentioned, that you feel currently that the department has not been as transparent as maybe you would have personally preferred it to be. Do you feel that that was an overcorrection of what happened with the reopening of the Clinton investigation? And if that's the case, do you feel somewhat responsible for that overcorrection?
So yes and yes. That I think what do they say about generals? That we're always fighting the last war. So I do think some of the criticism of the department, and again, what's strange is the reopening of the investigation in October 20th actually came from the Department of Justice, not the FBI. Wasn't the subject of press disclosure. But that doesn't matter. People think of it as a transparency event that was criticized. So sure, I think that there's a reaction to that. I also think probably slightly aside that, there's a desire to avoid controversy, and that no good comes as a Justice Department leader from being dragged into the wars between left and right in America right now. So I think I get that. Yeah, so logically I can draw a line to that. I don't feel responsible in the sense you may have meant it, because I actually think if you went back and really dug into it, you'd be hard-pressed to do something different than what we did on October 28th. And so I'm at peace with that decision.
Hey there, Kirsten Garris with Cox Media Group. I have a couple of questions. First, you kind of talked about making thoughtful decisions, but you've been removed for a few years now. Are there any decisions you think back, maybe I could have done something differently, or maybe there is a regret? Are there any one instance that you think about, we could have handled this differently?
Oh, sure. Top of my head. I screwed up the public beginning of the encryption debate. And I actually did it at one of our quarterly press roundtables. No, it wasn't your fault. It was my fault. That I don't want to get too boring, but I had seen in the media that morning, before the quarterly press roundtable, an advertisement that I think was from Google, might have been from Apple, but it doesn't matter. But the company appeared to my eyes and ears to be sort of bragging that they had created a mobile device with systems such that it was off limits to judicial authority, that it couldn't be opened even with a search warrant. And I thought, how can anybody think that's an unalloyed good? I get why there's lots of goodness in that, but an unalloyed good, holy cow. That's just nuts that we would create spaces in American life that would be off limits to judicial authority and the rule of law. Wow. And so I went into the press briefing. I don't think I brought it up. I think someone asked me something. And then I blasted that, and not in a thoughtful way. And so then it threw the encryption discussion down a lane of personal conflict, that it was me against Tim Cook. And so that's an easy narrative for people to follow and to write about, instead of what it should have been, which is a much more complex and nuanced and difficult conversation, where I share values on both sides of that equation. And so I totally screwed it up. And so one of my weaknesses, I have lots of them, but one of them has long been that I can be impulsive and convince myself I'm being decisive. And so sitting at that table, I thought I was being decisive and I was being an idiot. And it took I'm not sure I ever unrung that bell to get it back to a healthier place, away from the conflict, personal conflict narrative. So that's one. Go ahead.
And then just lastly, I know I last year covered extensively the different bomb threats that happened at HBCUs and tried to get more information from FBI. I always got a statement, but it was tough to get anything on camera. When, to your point, I think people want to hear from all sides of whatever's happening, want to know what the investigation looks like. What advice would you have for trying to crack into this DOJ, this FBI system now? Or what stood out to you when you were seeing different reporters at these quarterly meetings? What stood out to you about their either reporting or, how they approach different questions? Because I know I'd like to cover FBI more, but it's tough when we just get a statement. We're not getting access to in-person interviews or anything like that. And I'm in TV, so in-person.
Yeah, no, I know how important that is. And so I don't have a good answer for you. That I think it's mostly a tone that has to be set from the top. And my folks, and I'm sure the challenge of being the director is that it's such a hierarchical organization that if you're not careful, people will run away with what you said. And so you have to choose your words carefully. There's this famous story about Hoover was given a memo about a national security threat that was coming in from, I forget, whether from Mexico or Canada. And he wrote on the side of this memo, "Watch the borders." And then they came back to him 2 weeks later and briefed him that we've sent hundreds of people to this spot and this spot and this spot. We've stood up task forces all along the Canadian and the Mexican borders. And he said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, you wrote, 'Watch the borders.'" And he said, "I meant the margins. I want larger margins on these memos." And so maybe it's apocryphal, but it illustrates a real thing. And so I'm sure there are people who could argue that my desire to show our work to the American people through the media led to things, people having contacts with media they shouldn't have had. Sure. But in the main, it's about the tone that's set from the top. And so I don't know how to coach you. The current FBI director is a really good person, used to work for me, but I think just sees it closer to the way Director Mueller saw it than the way I saw it. And so I don't know how to crack through that.
In the search warrant, the example that you talked about earlier, what would it have looked like had it happened on your watch in terms of the engagement with the press?
This is really unfair because I don't like. I've been the subject of a fair amount of Monday morning quarterbacking, and so I don't know exactly, but I would have been keen, given some of the principles that I've had in discussions when I was director with police chiefs about police-involved shootings, is it's really important to fill the vacuum. Because it is true that lies make laps around the earth while the truth gets its boots on. And so you got to get your boots on and get out there right away. And What you fill the space with, ideally, is something that is allows the truth to run alongside, or at least stay within sight of the lies. And so that would have to be content that could be shared digitally very easily on social media platforms, probably a short video clip, something that is a 2022-23 way of sharing information that's more than just standing at a podium reading a statement. And so I would think speed plus how are people going to consume this information? And so what's the mode I should use? What should it look like? And so it's some mix of text and visuals to get out there. And you have tremendous flexibility under Justice Department rules. And you could say exactly what you said 3 days later at a podium in a different form that would show up on people's feeds at the same time that they're getting the lies about it's a court-authorized search presented to a neutral and detached magistrate who had to find probable cause and state with particularity the place, get that information out there. It's the idea that the FBI invaded a former president's residence as part of some jackbooted thug exercise, that you're running close to that. And again, lawyers have this problem in general because that feels beneath our dignity. Right, we're people of substance. But to come back to what I started with, the whole lifeblood of your institution is, do people believe that it's honest and trustworthy and doing the right things for the right reasons? And the only way they have an ability to make that judgment is based on information. So how do they get their information? And so how do you participate in that flow of information so you can equip them to decide whether they trust you or not?
Thank you. I'm Arthur with ABC News. We've talked a lot about rhetoric, abolish the FBI and the DOJ and kind of the hearings that have gone on Capitol Hill with that sort of rhetoric. But what do you think of, and how would you have handled the defund the police rhetoric?
Well, I guess it depends on what role I was in. I mean, if I was still FBI director during the defund the police, I think I would have done. I don't think there's a role for the FBI director to hit that directly, right? Because as a private citizen, my reaction was, we got all kinds of problems in policing, but the people that need the police most are not me. Because in my neighborhood, we're just going to hire private security guards, so find out the people who need the police most, how do they feel about it? And in my view, having spent a lot of time in hard-hit communities, they want better policing, but they want policing. And so, but I don't think as FBI director you can hit that. Instead, I think what I would do is, if I were still director during 2020, is do the things I did in 2015 in the wake of Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson and a whole bunch of other inexcusable uses of force by law enforcement. I would try to find ways to show the work of policing to people, especially people in the communities that are most in need and most worried about the quality of their policing.
Would your messaging include like showcasing how in some communities they need police more than others, like you just mentioned with your neighborhood, for example? Like, would you come out and say that, or is that showing weakness in a sense?
No, I think it's direct. I'm trying to think of things I talked about, because I talked a lot about policing and race in 2015. I went to Georgetown University and gave a really candid speech about policing and race that I remember Eric Holder calling me to say, dude, you can say that, right? Basically because of the way I look. I can criticize policing in a way that Eric couldn't, and so I tried to in a productive way. And so I think I would do just more of that. And the way I thought about, I'm a big metaphor person, but there are two lines in America: law enforcement and the communities, especially communities with high rates of poverty and violence and have been disserved by long history of our flawed country. And so those two lines have always been separated for reasons that make sense. But what happened to us in 15 and again in 20 is that the lines, driven by incidents that I totally understand why they did, started driving the lines away from each other. And And then I thought, what we need to do is find ways to bend those lines together, because the people in those communities want policing, but they want a certain kind of policing. And police, if they think about it, should want the same thing. And so I talked a lot about ways to arc those lines together and try to use the power of my office to do it. And the FBI is not a policing organization, but I gave that speech at Georgetown. Then I ordered all 56 field offices to bring in people from the communities hardest hit by crime and police organizations and bring them close to each other so that folks who are civilians can say, here's what we want. And police officers can say, here's what we need and why there might be estrangement on our side. When I got to Howard, one of the amazing things I learned at Howard is there's a class there called Policing Inside Out that I think is still taught by a woman named Binyan Muhammad. And Dr. Muhammad has 30 students in her class, 15 Howard undergrads, 15 active duty uniformed police officers. And she brings them together for a semester. And as she explained to me, is just the classroom is a really cool thing to watch. Because at the beginning of the semester, they sit like that. And then she pairs them and says to the 19-year-old, take this cop home with you. Have him walk your life. Have him see what it's like to be a 19-year-old walking home from the library at 11:30 at night and encountering law enforcement officers. And then do the reverse. Police officers take those undergraduates one-on-one home with you to your work. Have them see what you see through the windshield of your car at 2 a.m. And the amazing thing was, the geography of the classroom changed over the semester until they were sitting mixed together. And when the semester ended, both grieved the end of it. So what happened? They saw the world through each other's eyes. And it brought those lines closer together. And so I hadn't envisioned this kind of class, but that's what I was talking about when I was FBI director. And I don't know if there's a way to scale Dr. Muhammad's work, but I can't think of a better way to figure it out. And I have a son who's a police officer, and I wish all cops were like my son. I'm totally biased, but he's the only honors philosophy graduate of Kenyon College ever to become a police officer. But his view is every encounter is binary. Every encounter between a police officer and a civilian is only going to go one of two ways. It's going to end with that person having a better appreciation for the police or worse. There's no middle. And the police officer owns that encounter in the overwhelming main. And so finding ways to drive that approach, that culture into policing organizations is the only way in the long run we arc the lines closer together. So I don't think I would say defund the police makes no sense. If you think about the people who need the police most, which is not me, I think I would try and continue the work I'd done in 15 and after that until I got fired. Yeah, that's too long an answer. I'm sorry, but that's a really important topic.
Hey, I'm Hugo. I cover the department and the bureau. Two questions. I mean, first of all, watching the Mar-a-Lago thing play out, do you get the sense that the bureau scares too easy is maybe not the right word to say, but there's a very cautious kind of element to how the bureau operates now, especially with WFO as well. And do you get the sense that that's kind of a reactionary response, trying not to repeat what happened in 2016, whether it was with, the FISA applications or whether it was reopening the investigation?
Sure. I mean, to come back to the earlier question, Texas Tribune. I think a lot of it is overlearning the lessons of my life. I have to think that people, I haven't talked to Director Wray about this, but there has to be times when he looked at some of my experience and said, I don't want to live that, because this guy got hammered from all points. And then I would have urged, well, let's get the level below that and say, what was he hammered for and why? And what were the benefits to those costs? But I could sure see people having a reaction like, yeah, nothing good comes from interacting with the media. I mean, there were Inspector General reports criticizing FBI people for interactions with the media. And what do you say?
Devlin didn't mind. Everyone else.
Oh yeah, but those we're all of us in leadership roles in government are always reacting to the last IG report, And so I'm sure there's a fair number of that still going on in the FBI. And yeah, so I get why. I get why.
When you're talking about transparency, like I don't have a dog in this fight, like, Peter and I are friends, but, I'm just curious as an academic kind of question, where do you draw the line in terms of transparency? If you think back to 2016 and like, the release of Peter Strzok's text with, Lisa Page, is that something that goes too far in kind of in being transparent? I mean, in many ways, right, it kind of, you can see how the public might want to have an interest in knowing if the special agent in charge of that investigation has particular feelings about the subject of that investigation, especially if it's a counterintelligence one. Like, is that something you would have done if you had been asked to release those texts?
I don't know. I actually have not thought about that in a good enough way, and I'm not sure. Isn't there still litigation over whether the department should have done that? So I think it's a Privacy Act issue that I haven't spent any time thinking about. And so I don't know. So I haven't thought about that. But in general, I would try to lean as far forward as possible. If there was something that was material to the public faith and confidence in the work, and we could share it consistent with the Privacy Act and our policies and our precedent, those kinds of things, and an ongoing investigation, my default is always to try to share, because it never makes any sense to hold anyway. Everything comes out eventually. And so, yeah, that's probably the best answer I can give there. And I won't, I like Peter very much, but I will not go back and think more about his texts.
Hi, I'm Naomi Lim with the Washington Examiner. So Donald Trump is the front runner for the Republican nomination. He's not going away anytime soon. Neither is politicization of those two departments. I mean, what's your greatest fear if he is reelected? And then secondly, you sort of spoke about the gaggles that you would hold and that you didn't want them put on camera for fear of sort of performances from journalists, whatever.
Or me, or right, or that I might have an instinct to perform in some way that I shouldn't.
So to that end, like there's been a lot of talk about maybe reforming federal courts so that they're televised, particularly because of these Trump trials that are coming out. I mean, do you think that's a good idea? Does that help transparency and, justice, or does that make it worse?
Yeah. So the first one's easier. That I think it's deeply concerning. No matter where people are on the political spectrum, if they take the time to think about what it would mean if Donald Trump were president again. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining that to folks. I just hope thoughtful people will spend time thinking about that, armed with more knowledge about how he could do more to accomplish his retributive goals through places like the military and law enforcement, the intelligence community. So I think it's really important that he not be president of the United States again. But that's a choice for the American people to make. And I hope they'll engage and make the choice themselves. And I'm optimistic if the American people engage. I like, Lincoln used to like to quote, I guess, his Secretary of State Seward, who had this expression that went like, "There's always enough virtue to save America, but just enough." He said that during the Civil War. That's kind of the way I feel about America. We'll be okay. If the American people focus, we'll be okay. And so I already forgot the second piece of the question. Oh, yeah. I don't know. For us, my bias, I'm a federal court person. And so I've spent most of my litigation hours in federal court. I've seen a lot of the bad that cameras can do, bringing out, and people who think that a camera is going to give you a clear view of a case. Doesn't seem to me that it can give you a distorted view of a case. And so I'm not sure what the right answer is to whether we should televise any trials, particularly the Trump trials. So I'm not sure, leaning against, I guess is probably the way I'd say it. But part of the reason I'm hesitating is I don't think I've watched enough. I didn't watch Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, so I don't know whether if you really consume it on television, you can get an accurate view, materially more accurate view than you can through coverage without the images. I'm skeptical that you can, but so I'm leaning against is probably where I am. And no one cares. It doesn't matter to me. I don't get to make that decision, thank goodness, so I can meander.
Brian Mesker again. You've said a lot of times during this talk that you're optimistic and that you think things are going to be okay. And I guess I'll be blunt, like I don't really get that because I think a lot of folks who are in kind of a similar, call it anti-Trump, like political camp as you, really catastrophize about the potential future that we're looking at. And, just because things went a certain way historically doesn't mean they're going to be that way in the future. So, I mean, what is that? Is it like religious? Is it sort of a sense that like you can't be pessimistic because that's unproductive? Like what gives you the confidence that you have?
I think its source is logic and experience. That, right? I think often about what America was like when I was a little boy. The president was murdered on national television. His brains were all over his wife's pink dress. Then Dr. King was murdered. Malcolm X was murdered before that at the Audubon Ballroom. Then that slain president's brother, who was going to be the next president, was killed in the Ambassador Hotel Ballroom in Los Angeles. America's cities burned down. The pimple, 2020 was a pimple compared to what happened in this country in the late 1960s and early 70s. Thousands of young men were dying in the jungles of Southeast Asia for reasons that no one quite understood. Thousands of others were fleeing to Canada. We were trying to integrate schools, and people were just slaughtering each other to stop that. There were bombings every day in America. It's not an exaggeration. Every day there were bombings in America. And so the country was coming apart. And it didn't come apart. And then I look at the history of the 1920s, right? After tremendous progress by Black Americans and immigrants and Jews and women finally got the vote. What happened? Country started to come apart. Klan was reborn. I think what did Meacham's most recent book said? A third to a half of the members of Congress were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Our country, in all kinds of horrible ways, was coming apart, and it didn't come apart. So I really do think there's a lot to what Seward said to Lincoln. There is enough virtue, sometimes just enough to save America. I don't believe the American people are going to re-elect Donald Trump to be president of the United States, and by saying it, I worry that I'm going to jinx America, but I have no such power. We're going to be okay. This moment of demagoguery and insecurity and pain is going to pass. And so that's sort of why I say that. And also just my experience encountering with young people is we have an energetic, engaged, optimistic wave of people in Z and Zillennials. I guess I shouldn't, I have some millennial children, but that's unlike anything I've ever encountered. And so you put that together, and I'll say one other thing. We talk about the erosion of our institutions. I think one of the great stress test victories of the last 2 years has been the rule of law in this country. Unbelievable. Right? Why was Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the election 0-60? Because there is a culture that goes into bedrock in every courtroom in this country. It doesn't matter who the judge is. There's a culture that all lawyers are part of. You can lie all you want with your hair dye coming down your face in front of Four Seasons Total Landscaping, but you step inside an American courtroom, there are real consequences to false statements. And the American people have gotten to see that over and over and over again. You're seeing it now. I don't know how the Donald Trump cases are going to turn out, but this is what the rule of law looks like. And so it's frustrating sometimes when you're trying to change culture. I was in a lot of respects of the FBI. It's deeply reassuring to me when I know the culture of the rule of law in this country. I know the culture of the military. I know the culture of the law enforcement community. And so though that combination of things, that constellation of things makes me worry about things in the short term, but in the long run, optimistic. And yeah, things, and then when you're all old and gray, we'll be talking about how much worse things were when you were kids. Obama gave a great commencement address at Howard the year before I got there that I think pissed off a lot of the students and made their parents very, very happy, where he said, let's talk about what it was like when your parents were at Howard. And so that day will come, and you'll look back on this day and tell your kids, America was coming apart in 2023. but it won't. And I'm confident of that, again, for the reasons that I said.
I have a technical question about the documents case. So some of the charged documents in that were documents that were produced, or that were returned with the subpoena. And I was wondering if, in your experience with how the Bureau works, and I get you don't make the charging decisions, right? But is that the kind of thing you would have charged? Is that not kind of act of production doctrine protected? If you kind of respond to a subpoena and you return these documents and then you get charged for retaining those?
And the retention is based on the gap between your departure and your turning them over?
Yeah, Trump returned some of the classifieds. I mean, not all of them, right, clearly, but the ones that he did return were also included as counts in the indictment. Is that not protected by act of production?
I don't think so, but I haven't thought about it well, and I don't remember that coming up in a case that I've done. Because your possession, still a period of possession, the government have to prove it was knowing and willful possession, that there was criminal intent in connection with the possession. What you did with them by returning them may, I suppose, undercut their showing of criminal intent. But
they would probably say it's willful return as opposed to willful retention, right? If you've been subpoenaed and because they'd be subpoenaing contraband, essentially. It was just an interesting legal question.
Yeah, maybe. If you're a defense lawyer, you might argue, well, the fact that he returned it shows that it was a mistake, and he didn't realize that he had them or didn't realize he wasn't supposed to have them. But I haven't thought about it well enough to give you a good answer.
This is more kind of like a fun question. How much of the Comey rule is reality and what is not? Because I guess every TV show has things that are not real and things that are not real. So I was just curious to.
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't gone, since it's not my script, I haven't gone through it. But
I guess did you? I forgot to ask if you had watched it.
Yeah. And so there are parts of it that are so real, so accurate. That they stunned me. First of all, the depictions of a lot of the interactions of people at the FBI are, I don't think the exact conversations are there, but the tone and tenor and the way in which we've been around trying to figure out what the right thing to do was, that strikes me as dead on. The piece that I was surprised by, so surprised by I started crying watching it, was the way they captured the pain my family was in that I missed, which causes me pain even to say that to you. I should have known this. I'm able to shrug stuff off, but watching someone you love get attacked is a whole different deal. And so I think the scenes were made up of showing my daughters seeing stuff on Facebook and closing their laptops and things, and showing my wife react. But the truth that was captured there is one that I missed. And when I remember seeing it, I thought, oh my God, you self-involved, right? Oh my God. So I was quite emotional watching that. And then the other thing that maybe brought it home was Jennifer Ely, the actor who played my wife. Whoa. I mean, she is I'm not married to Jennifer Ely, but she is my wife. The way she looks, the way she talks. I mean, it's eerie. And so maybe that brought it home too. And I met Jeff Daniels one day. They invited me to come to Canada, to Toronto. I went one day to watch them film. I'd never been to a movie set. And I met him, and I watched them film the green room dinner scene. And it was really cool to watch. You probably have been to movie sets, but I had not. But Brendan Gleeson and Jeff Daniels did not rehearse, did not meet each other before that scene, because they wanted to maintain the kind of distance that I felt from Donald Trump. And then they shot it. It's like a 16-minute single take where the light, I totally missed this, fades the whole time, so slowly you don't notice it, your eye misses it, so that it starts a bright lit room and it's centered just a spotlight on the table at the end. I watched this thing and started to get nauseous, because it was so close to my memory of it that I went in and met them and I said, look, the highest compliment I could pay you is just ruin my freaking day, because wow, you transported me back into that moment. And so there are pieces of it that seem so real to me. And then other parts of it seem, I don't want to be tough on them, little Hollywood stuff going on. And I'm sure Jeff Daniels is only 6, I don't know what he is. I said, man, can you act taller? He said, this is Hollywood, where do you think you are? But yeah, so it makes me cringe a little bit, but parts of it really hit home.
I think all of us, through the movies, through the book, have learned a lot about your relationship with Donald Trump. But what was your relationship with President Obama? And obviously it was a different kind of relationship. You described it a little bit. It might be worthwhile recounting a little about how you all talked and decided how that relationship should go.
Yeah, I had never met him, and I meant what I was saying. I didn't apply to be FBI director. It wasn't on my radar screen. I just started teaching at Columbia and thought I'll be an academic. That's what I'll do. And then Eric Holder called and asked me to come down and be interviewed for the job. And I remember my wife, and I think this may be in the movie, but it's true whether it's not. Or she said, you got to go down there, because I had said I was not going to go down. And she said, you got to be interviewed. They're not going to pick you anyway. And she was kind of being funny, but she also thought, she knew that I'd given money to Mitt Romney and to John McCain. Now, I had done it because I was worried unprincipled people might take over the Republican Party, a crazy thing to worry about, I know. But she thought, no way this guy's picking you. And so I was maybe relaxed because of that, but I was very impressed in my conversation with him. And then he did a really interesting thing, is it went much longer than expected, and always had the White House counsel there. Never met with me without the lawyer there. And then invited me to come back before he made the public announcement. And he explained why. He said, as soon as I announce that you are my nominee to be director, you and I can never speak like this again. And he said, I thought I'd like to talk to you more. And so we spent an hour just talking about philosophy and history and families, not about the FBI's work. And I remember walking out, I turned to the Kathy Rumler, who's White House counsel, and I said, how did a person with a supple mind get elected president of the United States? Because I found him to be really smart, but also able to turn and say, that's interesting, and then make an argument against himself. And so I was very impressed with him, but he kept that promise that we didn't play basketball together, we didn't. And Mueller had told me the same thing. There's not going to be any contact. I mean, in a group setting, there'll be contacts, but same. George W. Bush was the same way. I got to see that up close during the nightmare you alluded to in the opening, during when I was Deputy Attorney General. He didn't hang out with Bob Mueller. He didn't have dinner with Bob Mueller, drinks with Bob Mueller, because he understood that for 50 years, what the American people have wanted is this. I'm in the executive branch, but I'm not entirely of the executive branch. And that's why that dinner alone so freaked me out, because it violated exactly what the country had told ourselves for 50 years we don't want. I have to follow orders. The president can fire me. I'm totally cool with that. I understand that as a matter of law, but I can't be on your team. And so I saw it up close with George W. Bush, and I saw it with Obama. And yeah, and so that's what was so shocking to me about the Trump approach. And look, I knew he didn't like me, and that's why I was surprised I was fired, because I thought, yeah, he really doesn't like me, but that's good, because in that frigid air, there's a distance between us. He's not going to invite me over for drinks or dinner, and I can't do that. But I'll say something else to you all that leave you on a slightly depressing note. The FBI's problem is, those 50 years mean the FBI has no friends in high places. Because back in the day, you read this amazing new biography of J. Edgar Hoover, which is so good, G-Man. It's a very nuanced view of Hoover that I don't think Beverly Gage, who's a Yale historian, expected. But she came out with a really interesting, it will surprise you, a lot of the things she found about Hoover. But one of the things she says about Hoover is, he didn't do anything as a rogue. Everything he did, he made sure his political masters knew what he was doing. And he did it as part of this dance to do favors for them. So the Democrats and Republicans, his two most powerful patrons were Johnson and FDR. They took care of him because he did things for them, and they always protected the FBI. The Bureau hasn't had that for half a century. And so if you think about the Bureau from a politician's perspective, nothing good comes from the FBI. These people are a pain in the neck. And so in a crisis, in a polarized time like we're in now, who speaks for the Bureau? We're now in this fascinating time where the only people speaking public are the Democrats speaking for the FBI, but it won't last. And it shouldn't, because the Bureau can't be on anybody's team politically. Can't do favors, can't be counted on. And that makes it unusual and lonely. And so in a way, the independence the American people have insisted on for half a century is a threat to the FBI's independence, because no one will speak for the FBI in a real lasting way, he says. So anyhow, good luck with that. I'm a fiction author now, so.
Well, I can hear those grandkids screaming from the car.
Stop! Stop.
No, but thank you so much
Yeah,
for the
I
time.
wish you all luck. You've
for the
chosen a
energy.
very difficult profession, essential. Can I say a word about what I think makes great journalists? I've spent a lot of time interacting with journalists. The best have always reminded me of the best agents or detectives in two respects. To be a great agent or detective, you have to have this weird combination of confidence and humility. You have to be confident enough to live through people lying about you and lying to you and manipulating and denying and all kinds of stuff that you deal with as an investigator and you deal with. But you have to be also humble enough to know that I could be wrong. And the best investigators are always the ones who say, no, I want to back up and look at the crime scene because I could be wrong. My brain has all kinds of biases. And so let me back up and ask, what am I missing? What am I missing? Always, always, always. That's one. Two, the best agents and detectives are really good at manipulating people. Really good at developing, not lying to people, but developing sources by listening to people that they'd rather not listen to, by nodding when someone's saying something is obviously insane, by coaxing people to violate a trust. Because developing great witnesses is all about getting them to betray their co-conspirators and betray the Cosa Nostra, or betray the cartel, or betray their boss, who's a congressman. That's at the essence of good investigation. It's at the essence of good journalism. And so you have to have this weird combination of being able to develop, recruit, manipulate the way CIA is particularly good at this, but you have to be good at this and also have this weird mix of confidence and humility. But I think that's the recipe for a great investigator, and I think it's the recipe for a great journalist. So go do. Yeah. Thanks for doing what you do. Good luck.